I'm Rosalind Carita, and this is your history and your heritage. Today I am at Fort Campbell and at the Pratt Museum. And today we're going to take a little trip back to 1846, and we're going to focus on the Tennessee Militia, and specifically the Mexican War. So stay with us to learn about our history as the Tennessee Militia.
From exploring your local community to finding new adventures in the outdoors and discovering the world, Girl Scouts opens doors to new and exciting experiences for girls. Girl Scouts builds girls of courage, confidence, and character who make the world a better place. Through Girl Scouts, girls and adult volunteers discover the fun, friendship, and power of girls together. Interested in joining? Girls and adult volunteers are welcome in Girl Scouts. Please contact me, Bethany Kelly, at your local Girl Scout office by calling 931-648-1060 or visit us on our website at www.gsmidtn.org.
Today I have with me John O'Brien, and John's official title is the Installation Historian. We are at Fort Campbell, we are at the Pratt Museum, and today John is really going to teach us about the Tennessee Militia. So what was the Tennessee Militia?
The Tennessee Militia came into being when we had the state of Tennessee formed, and you have to remember at that time that the United States of America was brand new. We were trying to figure out how to be a nation, how to be citizens of a republic.
So we're talking about 1796.
In that time frame.
Okay.
And the government of the United States in the Militia Act creates the requirement for militias to be formed. And in the United States, our tradition is that all males, 18 to 45, citizens of the United States, are members of the militia.
And that's very different than the way we really think about it. So in this time period, we had a militia, was what would have been essentially the standing army?
No.
Okay. So
very specifically different.
Okay. Because
there is a standing army, the Continental Army,
okay,
initially when the country's formed, and the responsibility of keeping the king's peace comes from our English heritage.
Okay.
So all men are required to offer service in exchange for their liberty, as the price of liberty. We have something new in the United States, though, federalism.
Right.
So we're going to have a federal government and we have our state governments.
And hence we begin to see this concept of the militia.
Correct.
Okay, so bring us down the road.
Tennessee is going to put a militia together, and it's going to be in accordance with the laws of the United States. But it's going to form all of that formally in the Militia Act of 1840.
Okay.
And what we see from that is that all the male members of the state of Tennessee, 18 to 45,
and these would have been white men.
Correct.
Okay.
Are members of the militia, and a whole political infrastructure develops around it, where in every county, militia regiments militia companies are formed. Companies then build into battalions and build into regiments. Regiments are multi-county affairs, and then eventually the state is divided into 4 divisions. But the important part about the militia in the state of Tennessee at this time is, first of all of those officers that form the militia are elected during regular general elections. The company commanders, the lieutenants, are elected, the battalion commanders, the colonels and the majors are elected.
Whole different concept than what we think of. So all of these folks were elected, and the person who oversaw that election was the sheriff.
The county sheriff, as with all other elections in the county. So the state has its militia all the way up to the governor, of course, who commands the militia, and he approves the commissions of those that are elected. The Tennessee militia is called out several times in its history. The War of 1812 is the first time the federal government has a regular army and then the U.S. volunteers.
Okay.
So militias are asked to provide formed units who leave their state and work for the federal government. So the relationship is a regular professional national army and a citizens army, the volunteer units. Tennessee volunteers fight in the War of 1812, particularly under Andrew Jackson, who begins the war as a Tennessee militia member and eventually has a commission as a general in the regular army, fights the Battle of New Orleans. The militia also fights, the Tennessee militia fights in the Seminole Wars of 1818, 1832. It participates, again, the governor's asked to provide forces for the Cherokee removal in 1836. And most importantly, what we're going to talk about today, or the next major event, is participation in the Mexican-American War of 1846. Now, those are times where the militia is called out. But in the meantime, the militia is doing something very special for the state of Tennessee.
Tell us a little bit about that.
All the institutions of the new republic have to be built. Political parties, churches, the militia.
Because, just to kind of build the continuity, the church, before, when our folks were in England, the king was the head of the church. And so now they're in the United States, no more king. So there is a separation. And so all those church institutions are developing. And so the militia, tell us, that role is very separate, and they help develop all these other organizations.
Right. We are very comfortable thinking today as one nation.
Right.
Back at the time that we're talking about, the nation was in formation.
Right.
And the way that people identified with the nation most tangibly was through the militia. The militia would muster, men would gather, and they would remember the wars, or the battles of the Revolution. And they would celebrate those, and national holidays such as the 4th of July, Washington's birthday, after the Battle of New Orleans, of course, the War of 1812. And the militia would form and muster as part of public celebrations. And there would be men in uniform there to, number one, have national identity.
Right.
Number two, particular to Tennessee, regional identification of the role of Tennessee within this thing called the nation. And then beyond that, it's citizens getting together at the county level and forming together, men getting together and doing the drill and identifying with one another. So you have this political formation that's going on. And so it becomes very important for understanding the growth of Tennessee, for the growth of Tennessee regional identity, and for the relationship between Tennessee as a member of the Union. All of that's played out through the militia activities.
Okay.
And then when the Congress requires volunteers, they come from the militia. Now, you must be a member of the militia if you're a male, white male, 18 to 45. But no one was ever compelled to fight for the militia. It was always done on a volunteer basis. So the governor could call out the militia, but accept volunteers. And on our flag here, what we're going to talk about in the remainder of the program is one of these regiments called into being by the Congress of the United States through the governor of the state of Tennessee for volunteers, a key word when you're understanding Tennessee history.
Exactly.
And so we'll talk about the 1st Regiment of Tennessee Volunteers, formed under Colonel William Bowen Campbell.
And we are here at Fort Campbell,
for whom our installation's named.
So this really is a very direct connection for us, and that really sets up what we're going to talk about now in terms of where did these folks go, what was the battle about, what happened and what are we hoping that we can get to happen. So this is a great way to set us up to know just a little bit about the history. And I did think it was interesting that you talked about, we know that in Tennessee today we think in terms of the 3 grand divisions, but you really talked about the 4 regions of Tennessee as far as the militia. So it was thought of a little differently.
Right, and the Eastern Division of the 3 grand divisions are the Eastern, the Middle, and the Western. At the time that we're talking about in 1840, if you took that Middle Division, Middle Tennessee, and had a northern part from just south of Nashville up to the border, and then down south, so the Middle Division was divided
north-south.
North-south.
Okay. Thank you. I feel like we're really set up now to take this trip to fight the Mexican War. I'm here at the Pratt Museum at Fort Campbell, and I have with me today Jim Page. And Jim is very knowledgeable about our militia, and we're going to start talking in the year, imagine yourself, in 1846. So take us there.
Well, what happens in 1846 is that what was then the Republic of Texas is annexed to become the state of Texas in the United States, and it starts a chain of events between the former Republic of Texas, now the state of Texas, the United States of America, and the Republic of Mexico. And it starts a chain of events based on over where is the southern border of the new state of Texas. Is it the Rio Grande River or is it the Nueces River? The United States Army under Zachary Taylor moves into the disputed area between the 2 rivers, claims it for the United States. Mexican authorities see this as a violation of their national sovereignty. They move Mexican soldiers into disputed territory, and a clash of arms happens there. And the United States Army fights 2 major battles there at a place called Palo Alto and a place called Resaca de la Palma. And based on those events and a series of things called the Thornton Affair and other things that happened, the United States and Mexico go to war.
Okay.
And that is now has been known as the War with Mexico, the Mexican War, and is now commonly known as the Mexican-American War, which happened between 1846 and 1848.
Okay, so it was a complicated series of events.
Yes.
So Zachary Taylor, president.
He was then a general in the Army.
Okay, he was then a general, later becomes president, is involved in the actual conflict, bringing troops there.
That's
so
right.
then how is it, explain to us how the 1st Regiment of Tennessee gets there.
Well, it kind of goes to talking about what we talked about earlier with the state militia program in general. The United States Army, the regular Army, was very small. And we had a tradition of keeping a very small regular army, which would be augmented in times of war by calling up the state militias and asking for volunteers. When the United States Army, as small as it was fighting the Mexican Army in this disputed area there along the border, it was recognized early on that the regular army was going to be entirely too small to fight a war that was going to expand to be much larger.
Right.
So based on that, President James K. Polk issued a call for volunteers.
Right.
And he started initially with calling for volunteers from the westernmost states, which in those days were the states of Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Illinois, who were along the Mississippi River.
And we don't think of those as being western states, but at that time they were. And of course, James K. Polk was a Tennessean.
That's right.
Okay, so he
called initially for volunteers, and he called for the volunteers from the westernmost states. Primarily primarily because of proximity. These states could put soldiers on boats, send them down the Mississippi River, get them to the seat of the war faster.
Okay.
And that other units from the eastern states would come as time permitted later. So the initial call for volunteers went out. The call for the Tennessee's contingent was for 2,600 volunteers.
Okay.
Over 30,000 Tennesseans volunteered to become part of this contingent of Tennesseans to go to Mexico.
Okay, and I think really that's where we kind of interject what we know about why they call us the volunteer state.
Right.
And that originated in 1812.
Right.
But it really came home again that when the call went out, Tennessee answered.
That's right. Tennessee answered that call, and it had been known as the volunteer state before, but it really took hold during the Mexican War and the call out. And it was said that a man could not buy for any price a position to be among those 2,600 Tennesseans that was going to go to fight in Mexico.
Wow.
And so the Tennessee contingent was for 2 regiments of volunteer infantry, the 1st and the 2nd regiments of Tennessee Volunteers.
And here's our 1st regiment.
That's right.
Okay.
And a 600-man contingent of cavalry. And the 1st Regiment of Tennessee Volunteers came from the middle tier of counties in what is today Middle Tennessee.
Okay.
Sumner County, Davidson County, Lawrence County, Marshall County, Warren County, Bedford County, and others all provided company-sized units, 80 men to 100 men, were formed from the militia, and they were called to federal service, and then entered at that point. They left the state service, were no longer part of the state militia, and entered as volunteers to go to the federal government. So they essentially, the governor, Aaron Venable Brown, raised the Tennessee militia, activated them, and then essentially handed these militia units over to the federal government as volunteers to go fight in Mexico.
Okay, so they go to Mexico, and kind of give us an idea. What did that look like? How were they utilized? What kind of battles did they fight in? What is the story here?
Well, it's important to note that when the 1st Tennessee Volunteers left Nashville in June 1847, they left about 1,000 soldiers strong. And during the course of the 1 year that their commitment was to fight for 1 year in Mexico, they came back home a year later with about 350 soldiers left.
That's just an incredible loss.
It is. Through sickness, outright death, and the least of which was the attrition through battlefield casualties. By far, the biggest casualty producer in this regiment was sickness and illness.
Do we have any idea what kind of illness or sickness? I mean,
malaria, typhoid. I mean, you think you've got all of these 1,000 soldiers who've never been packed together closely and so closely together at any time in their life. They're traveling overseas, they're exposed to foreign air and different food and disease. They're passing disease from each other. And it was a situation that was rife. Field sanitation was quite poor in the military camps in those days, and it began to wreak havoc on the volunteer regiments in particular, who were not accustomed to living together in such close quarters.
Right.
When the regiment, the 1st Tennessee Volunteers, would become known later as the Bloody First Volunteers, they went to New Orleans, they got to Mexico, and then during the course of 1 year of fighting in Mexico, they fought in the Battle of Monterey in September of 1846. They fought at the Siege of Veracruz, Mexico in March of 1847, and their last battle was the Battle of Cerro Gordo, Mexico, which was in April of 1847. By that time, their 1 year service was up, and their obligation was over, and they came home.
They went home. So let's kind of go back to Monterey, because that's where our real story is going to focus.
Right.
So in Monterey, draw us a picture. Tell us what happened.
During the Battle of Monterey, the Mexican forces under General Pedro Ampudia was occupying the city of Monterey. General Zachary Taylor was commanding the American army, and he divided his army into 3 equal parts called divisions.
Okay.
The 2 divisions were regular army forces, active duty military personnel essentially, and the 3rd division, or 3rd part, was all volunteer force, which consisted of Kentuckians, Ohioans, Mississippians, and our Bloody First Tennessee. And the battle was essentially was joined on September 21st, 1846. And what happened is that the Army wants to highlight the role of the regular Army. This is the first large-scale foreign war the United States has ever fought. West Point, the officers who were in the regular Army were West Point graduates, and they really wanted to highlight the capability of a federal Army.
Right.
So what they did was the regular Army intended to take and keep most of the glory for itself while relegating the volunteer forces to a place where they were going to do little damage and have little damage done.
And little opportunity for glory.
And little opportunity for glory, that's right. And that was kind of the point at Monterey, and would be a recurring theme throughout the Mexican War with regard to volunteer units. So at the Battle of Monterey, September 21st, 1846, General Taylor sends his army, and he sends the volunteer division, only part of it, which is 1 regiment of Tennesseans, the Bloody First Tennessee, and the 1st Mississippi, which is commanded by a guy named Colonel Jefferson Davis, who'd later be the president of the Confederacy during the Civil War. And they get relegated to this, what they'd call it, a demonstration. Go over here on the eastern edge of the city, attack that little fort over there, and just basically stay out of the regular army's way.
And that was the tannery.
And it was, and the Mexicans had fortified an existing tannery, leather tannery, and an existing distillery house by taking those buildings and adding fortifications around it to kind of strengthen these buildings and to turn it into a fort.
Right.
And that was the objective. The Tannery Fort, or the La Tanneria Fort, was the objective of the 1st Tennessee and the 1st Mississippi on the first day of fighting there at Monterey.
And so then what happened during the battle?
Well, during the course of the battle, the Tennesseans and the volunteers are actually engaged pretty early on in the fighting, and they get involved in a very pitched and very bloody fight around this tannery fort. The 1st Tennessee and the Mississippians approach abreast of each other, approach the fort from the north, and the Mexicans' artillery began to take effect in killing soldiers almost immediately. And among the first soldiers to be killed was Captain William Bethel Allen, who commanded one of the Tennessee companies from Lawrenceburg. And he was killed almost immediately during the opening salvos of the battle, and that would be the first of many casualties that the 1st Tennessee would suffer at Monterey that day. Of the 350 Tennessee soldiers who were engaged at the Battle of Monterey, 26 of them would be killed outright, and another 70 or so would be horribly wounded, and many of them would later die of their wounds. And because of that major fight at Monterey, the 1st Regiment of Tennessee Volunteers became known as the Bloody First.
Okay, now that kind of makes sense.
Right. And of all the soldiers who were killed at the Battle of Monterey, 1 out of 4 was a Tennessean. So the 1st Tennessee suffered more casualties than any other unit, regular Army or volunteer, at the Battle of Monterey.
And so as we kind of get into this story, we know that there were a large number of Tennesseans who died, as you say, outright, right there on the field. And this was a fairly quick battle, if I'm remembering correctly, and we withdrew.
The battle lasted for about 3 days.
Okay, not so quick.
The Tennesseans, though, had the initial fight around the Tannery Fort, and then that was all. There wasn't enough of them left to pursue the fight.
Okay.
So for the Tennesseans, it was a quick fight.
All right.
Other units followed on, exploited the success they had accomplished, the foothold in the city of Monterey, and went on to fight for another 2 days, the 22nd and the 23rd of September. But for the Tennesseans, the Battle of Monterey was largely over.
So how does this end? How is it that American soldiers leave?
Well, the Battle of Monterey is not an outright military victory. The Mexican forces inside the city approached Zachary Taylor under a flag of truce, and then they agree to surrender the city, but they don't officially surrender the army. So a surrender negotiations are entered between Taylor and General Ampudia, and then they agree to the Mexican forces withdraw from Monterey and simply take their weapons and leave the city into the hands of the Americans. And in that way, the American army takes over Monterey, and then the Mexican army simply leaves. Under the terms of the agreement that the two armies would separate themselves for a period of about 8 weeks or so until the terms of the truce could be ratified by the respective governments. And in the end of the day, it never was, and then hostilities resumed shortly thereafter.
And to this day, there are American soldiers, Tennesseans, whose remains are still in Monterey. And you have done a great yeoman service. I mean, you have really followed up on this. And there are Tennesseans still in Mexico, and I'd like for you to tell us a little bit about how they were discovered and the archaeology and exactly where those bodies are now.
After the battle was over, the history of the 1st Tennessee said that the bodies of the Tennesseans were buried in shallow graves nearby where they fell. So they literally just next to the body dug a shallow grave, put the body in it, and covered it over. Over the years, the city of Monterey has grown and expanded into a very large and very vibrant city in northern Mexico. And then the battlefield, what was on the outskirts of the city in 1846, has gradually creeped its way toward the city center as the city, like all cities, have grown to encompass a larger and larger square footage, square mileage. And so the bodies were simply lost under modern buildings, under modern parking lots, and in some cases the historical sites were very near to be lost. In 1996, a construction crew in Monterey began bulldozing a site for the construction of an apartment building. And when they did, they discovered the remains of human skeletal remains buried in the ground. That ceased work almost immediately, and the Mexican National Institute of Anthropology and History, their equivalent to the Smithsonian, their archaeologists came out, conducted a survey of the graves, and determined that these were probably those of American soldiers killed during the 1846 Battle of Monterey.
And the artifacts that you were showing are so interesting. I mean, buttons and coins, things that are very easy to date and recognize, and of course the bodies themselves.
Right.
They went to a lot of trouble. The archaeologists, you have wonderful pictures of the digs. And so where are those bodies now?
The remains were recovered and they were placed in storage in an old cathedral building in Monterey. And within the last year or so, they've been moved to a larger storage facility in Victoria, Mexico. So if you can imagine a banker's box, a large cardboard box of remains, one set of human remains to each box. And they're presently in a storage shelf in Victoria, Mexico, waiting for them to come home or their ultimate burial, whatever the final disposition of these skeletal remains ends up being.
And I know that you have really tried to interest folks in helping us get these remains. You know, we are very connected to the military community, and we know that we don't leave people behind.
Right.
And so it's not about an artifact exchange. It really is about bringing really heroes. I mean, to us, they were heroes. To those in Mexico, they probably don't look at them as heroes, they see them as soldiers.
Right.
But these were volunteers. They were people who left their families and answered the call of the governor,
right.
And joined and fought. So tell us about your work trying to get these fellas home.
It's been a difficult road to get people interested in these particular sets of remains. There are complicated questions of jurisdiction between state and the federal government, jurisdiction between the United States and the Mexican government as well, and over the responsibility of just who is responsible for taking control of the human remains, who pays for the testing, and all the complicated questions of what to do with these remains. It's not as simple as simply going down, picking them up, and bringing them back. The process has been a long and deliberate one, but as you say, you know, these were somebody's fathers, somebody's sons, a fellow Tennessean who, even though the war was 165 years ago, the Army has this thing called the warrior ethos that says that I will never leave a fallen comrade. And I know that the Army and the United States has placed an extraordinary amount of effort to recover, to identify, and properly bury the remains of its servicemen, no matter where in the world they may be. And this is a little more complicated question because there are a lot of difficult relations between the two countries these days. This war is especially difficult, but sticking point between the two governments. And then there's also the question of 166 years almost that have passed by. And the people, you may be inclined to say, why is it so important to bring these remains back, you know, after such a long period of time? But I will tell you, my personal sense is that they are fellow Tennesseans and they died in the service of their country, and that the Mexican authorities have done tremendous work in identifying and caring for these remains. And they've done a yeoman's work there, and I can't offer them enough congratulations and thanks for the work that they've done. But ultimately, I think it's time, if possible, to bring these men back home and bury them in their native soil. And
is there
Middle
anything
Tennessee.
that we can do? I mean, I think that, you know, this show is about history and heritage. Is there anything that we can do as citizens, as people who care? Do you have any thoughts?
Oh, I do. There are really two things that I would recommend if people find this story interesting and would like to get involved in. One is to do something that may be a little counterintuitive. The first is to write the Mexican consulate in the United States or the Mexican embassy and thank them for the job and the work that they've done on taking care of the human remains. And second, contact your local, member of Congress or your General Assemblyman, and just ask them to look into it and to see where they may be able to offer some help.
And you know, we know that these are Tennesseans. You have a list of the names, you know where they came from.
Right.
I mean, our state representatives, our state senators could actually be able to try to bring somebody back to their community.
That's right.
So we will put up on the screen how to get in touch with Jim and some other phone numbers, so that will make it a little easier for you. And I know we're just about out of time, and this has been a great story. This is your history, it is your heritage. You can come out to the Pratt Museum and learn more about what we have at Fort Campbell. This is a great museum. I want to invite you to come out here. It's open how many days a week?
It's open 6 days a week, closed on Sundays.
And so this is a great opportunity for you to come and learn not only about the history of your state, but also of your country. Remember, it's your state, it's your history, and your heritage.